Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Straightforward, brought to you by me, Carl Al-Khuwaili. This week we saw a remarkable speech by Britain's Prime Minister, Mr David Cameron. To some, it was about time to address the issue of extremism, and others believe that the situation requires a better understanding of Islam and not, as they argue, a crackdown on Islam. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, thousands are dying in the name of, under the banner of takfir, the practice of quasi-excommunication, where a Muslim can declare any non-Muslim an infidel, even though a declaration of takfir is generally considered null and void if the target refutes it or if the Islamic community in which he or she lives refuses to accept it. Despite this, people are being beheaded or bombed. Atrocities are occurring, atrocities that would perhaps stay in the memory of a generation. So before we welcome our guests today, let's have a look at this brief report.
In a keynote speech on Monday, British Prime Minister David Cameron set out the government's 5-year strategy for tackling extremist ideology, describing it as a struggle of our generation. Speaking in Birmingham, Cameron said Britain has to confront a lack of integration in some areas that leaves young people vulnerable to the supposed glamour of ISIS propaganda.
Any strategy to defeat extremism must confront head-on the extreme ideology that underpins it. We must take its component parts to pieces: the cultish worldview, the conspiracy theories, and yes, the so-called glamorous parts of it as well. In doing so, let us not forget our strongest weapon, our own liberal values. We should expose their extremism for what it is, a belief system that glorifies violence and subjugates its people, not least Muslim people.
The Prime Minister said the government would work with Syrian, Iraqi and Kurdish communities who understand what life is like under ISIS to explain to young and vulnerable people the brutal reality of its ideology. British media reported that Muslims in Birmingham gave a mixed reaction to David Cameron's speech on tackling extremism, with some echoing his condemnation of British Muslims who had travelled to Syria to join Islamic State, while others argued that he was unfairly stigmatising people.
Let me first welcome our guest, Mr. Jonathan Fryer. Thank you very much for coming. It's good to have you again on the show. And on confronting radical ideology, Mr. Cameron in his speech said that the most effective weapon to confront this is British liberal values. What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was basically addressing two audiences in Britain. One, if you like, the indigenous majority, to reassure them that the government is actually tackling this issue, which is so concerning to the public. But the other was directed at UK's Muslim population, which is a quite considerable and a fast-growing number of people. I have to say, although I suppose I'd call myself a liberal, the word liberal is a bit problematic for many Muslims, because particularly in the Arab world it has a connotation of a bit of sort of libertarian or of having a rather carefree lifestyle. So that in a sense is a problem, but I think British values in the sense of tolerance, in the sense of a form of pluralism which is inclusive rather than divisive, certainly have a lot to teach us.
And you're familiar with many groups within Islam, whether here in the UK or in the Middle East. The Prime Minister mentioned a process that goes from being a pious religious Muslim to someone who would go out of their way to become a radical, calling for violence and so on. Now, in your opinion, which part in the said process is the most critical, where the youth tend to radicalise?
Well, it seems that a great number of the youth that have been radicalised through the internet, through videos, through online chats, and of course a particular number of radical imams. And that is a problem that Britain does have to confront, that although most imams and most mosques are responsible, there are some who are preaching a particularly narrow and, I have to say, aggressive form of Islam, which most Muslims would not recognise as Islam today.
Why are they doing so under the banner of Islam if most Muslims aren't buying into it?
It seems to be partly the huge effect that Wahhabi Islam has had with the backing of Saudi money and Saudi
into the UK,
clerics,
Saudi money
into
in the
UK and all over the world.
But for the UK particularly, how is the money channeled into those imams, to the charities that they are engaged with? How is it channeled? Wahhabi money you just mentioned.
Yes, well, the Wahhabi money has been used for, obviously, for building mosques and supporting all sorts of Islamic groups and bringing people into the country or training people who have a very narrow interpretation of Islam, and particularly Islam in the world today. And that is a problem. I mean, if we look at some of the statements by Mr. al-Baghdadi of Islamic State, and then go back to the teaching of
Islam.
Wahhab,
yes.
of Wahhab specifically, then we can see very close parallels.
That's very interesting. And now we are joined by Raza Nadeem, UK Muslim Public Affairs Committee member. Welcome to our discussion today. Mr. Nadeem, award-winning journalist Alison Pearson, she's a columnist as well. She wrote, "I like the Prime Minister's speech on tackling the extremist threat and the failure of Muslim integration." So she said she could have written his speech herself. She highly associates with it. What do you have to say?
All I can say to that is thank God she's not the Prime Minister then, because David Cameron's speech is one of the most divisive things I've heard. And actually, everything he said has no grounding in reality and is based on an ideological pursuit to stop any dissent against this country's unjust foreign policy and the fact that Muslims are being marginalized and alienated here. It's shocking. The whole speech, all of it, was absolutely disgusting in the way Muslims were being talked at. And rather than dealing with the actual root causes that have been well documented, but this government chooses to ignore, David Cameron chose to give another patronizing speech. And people often say, you know, this speech was very refreshing, it's a different speech. And no, it actually isn't. If you look at the speech he gave in Munich a couple of years ago and the one in Bratislava recently about Muslims silently condoning terrorism and ISIS, the only difference that this speech has with those speeches is that for the first time David Cameron stayed inside the country to talk down to us rather than go out the country.
And you mentioned he should have rather addressed the root causes of the issue. Tell us about those causes.
Well, the root causes are simple and they've been very well documented. Now, let's go through them bit by bit. Let's look at the actual evidence that's come out constantly in the literature and even from the fighters that have gone abroad and in some cases come back because they disagree with ISIS. The reason why people have gone abroad is because they are against our country's unjust foreign policy and they're sick and tired of seeing Muslims being killed, and some have been driven to take violent action because they feel they can't do anything about our foreign policy here. And the other reason why people have gone abroad, and they're all linked, is because they do not feel part of British society. They feel like they do not have a stake in our country, and what's happened is that David Cameron just ignored all those facts. Now, he did mention, to his one credit, I will give him, he did mention how Islamophobia makes young Muslims feel alienated, but the problem is David Cameron has had 5 years already in a coalition government and now here as a full Tory government, and he's taken no real steps to deal with these issues. If anything, things have become much worse.
Speaking of segregation, you just mentioned, do you really believe there's a segregation within the fabric in the UK when it comes to religious belief?
Yeah, of course. We live in a very broken society. I know David Cameron used that speech, that term "broken Britain" ages ago, but the reality is he's contributed to it. The fact that Muslims don't feel part of this country, and again, the fact, you mentioned that journalist before said that Muslims need to do more to integrate. You're asking a minority who are being constantly maligned to do more to integrate. When she means integrate, she actually means assimilate. And that's part of the issue, which is the way Muslims are spoken to is so deeply Islamophobic, it's off-putting. And all you have to do to see the impact of David Cameron's speech is to go to social media and look at what young Muslims were saying about his speech. And even the Newsnight report that was on the BBC Two, the Monday of the speech. And the majority of people, especially young people, are saying that, again, I feel much more alienated because David Cameron is just ignoring me and saying, no, this is the problem because I know better than you because I'm the Prime Minister, and this is what you Muslims need to do. And if anything, I can guarantee you something. If we pursue this line of thinking more in this country, things will get much worse. That is a guarantee, and it's a sad guarantee that I have to give, but it will get worse.
Mr. Nadeem, speaking of segregation as well, some argue, on the other hand, that when it comes to segregation, we've seen events in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham that are segregated based on gender. So what do you have to say about that in the UK?
About segregated events is that David Cameron has shown an extreme double standards in his approach to that. So let me give you an example. We talk about Muslim events being segregated. Now basically that comes from a norm where men and women generally like to separate, and we can discuss the merits of that whatever some other time. And we had people jump on the bandwagon and say, see, look at these Muslims, they're so barbaric that the men and women sit separately, which was basically the undertone of their argument. But what you had was, during the general election, David Cameron attended a Sikh event, and there he sat with the men, whereas the women sat separately, and no one was turning around saying, how can David Cameron support a segregated event? So I don't think these issues of segregation, I don't believe we're having a genuine discussion about them. These issues are being used as an opportunity to attack Muslims, and David Cameron is just adding to that.
Well, my last question won't keep you too long, Mr. Nadeem, and it's a rather, perhaps, very honest question. Now, the Prime Minister addressed Muslims who have they addressed Muslims who believe that British foreign policy justifies their anti-British rhetoric and acts. Now, can we clarify this? You're open about what you deem failures in the British system and its foreign policy. Hiding other rhetorics for the sake of political correctness from the media side or the other side is not going to help. So can I just address this honestly? What is it for the UK Muslim, let's say clearly Asian community, that is so defensive about foreign policy in Iraq and the Middle East, while, for example, when it comes to Palestinians or Iraqis, we see a form of protest that is rather peaceful, not calling for jihad, not joining ISIS, not going beyond the limits of lawlessness. So can you explain this a little bit? What is it that takes the youth to be so radical about it?
The whole thing is linked. You can't separate. Even when it comes to the whole issue of Iraq and Syria, again, it was people saw a dictator and they wanted to do something about it. People have often, and they've spoken with the same passion about Palestine as well. Now, I know what you're alluding to. You're alluding to the fact about, people, you're trying to say that people go abroad because of the whole Sunni Shia thing. And again, even that is because of America and Britain's foreign policy, because there's very well documented about how, we had people like General Petraeus from the US Army, who specifically, they had made plans to play on the sectarian differences in society to get people to fight. And, the former US General Wesley Clark said that they funded zealots to fight because that's the only way they can defeat Hezbollah. All this stuff, again, comes back to our country's unjust policies and that they've been playing just a game with people's lives in the Middle East, and guess what? It's come back to bite them. Now, I'm not saying it's right, and which I know because I'll be painted as someone that's trying to justify this. No, I'm going to be clear on this. This stuff is happening because our government is being irresponsible and is not looking at the safety of our own citizens and looking at the safety of other people around the world. When they change their attitude, I can assure you, and when David Cameron stops talking down to Muslims, I can guarantee you will see such a massive change and shift in the dynamic of how Muslims live in this country and how they feel about this country.
But then again, it's conditional. It's tit for that in a way. You said when they change their attitude, only then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but the thing is because you can't expect me or the Muslim community who are being demonized and attacked to say, you need to learn to put up with this more often. Saying, no, what needs to happen is the cause is our unjust policy. So it's not that I need to build up more of a tolerance to our unjust policy. What needs to happen is the policy needs to change. And what MPAC and other Muslim groups are doing is trying to empower young Muslims to change the policy from this country. But what the government needs to do is whenever anyone talks about our unjust policies, not to shout them down and say that they're Islamists or non-violent extremists.
Well, speaking of extremists, Mr. Nadeem, speaking of extremists, we see a lot of comments on Twitter and other social media where Muslim journalists, academics and activists are always put on a scale so as to rate their Islamism, starting from Imam Anjem Chowdhury, even yourself, and the chairman of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee in the UK. It seems like Ashghar Bukhari, it seems like it's some sort of, excuse my term, they put you on an Islamometer which measures not one's piousness but links their rhetoric to terror and national security. Do you accept this?
Well, I don't accept it, but I've come to accept the fact that this is how our government deals with
It's
these
not just
issues.
the government, Mr. Nadeem. I'm talking about left-wing bloggers and writers on the social
Yes,
media.
well, the thing is, yes, sorry, yes, you're right. In terms of that sense, yeah, you're right. People, they do, they look at what we're saying about these issues, and rather than engage with me, USCA, MPAC, and even CAGE and other Muslim organizations that speak out, rather than engage with us on the issues, what they do is they just say, oh, they're a bunch of extremists, and discredit what we're doing. But the reality is, we're spot on. If the government listened to what we're saying, you'd see an end to terrorism straight away. But they're not, because they're not interested in ending terrorism.
Raza Nadeem, UK Muslim Public Affairs Committee member, joined us from Manchester. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Fryer, Simon Tisdall writes in The Guardian, the Prime Minister could be leading us into another open-ended Middle East conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't share Mr. Tisdall's pessimism on that. I mean, the Prime
Or maybe
Minister has
sensationalism?
a certain degree of journalistic sensationalism, because certainly the Prime Minister did rule out direct boots on the ground. And indeed, we have to remember that in 2013, the British Parliament voted against military intervention in Syria. So I don't expect to see direct involvement, but what we are seeing, without a doubt, is greater perhaps financial and political engagement by Britain in the whole struggle against Islamic State.
And Mr. Cameron wants to tackle the violent and non-violent here on UK soil when it comes to extremism. He says the new strategy would take steps to confront groups and organizations that might not advocate violence, but groups that do promote extremism. How important is this to start before things get to an irreversible position?
Well, certainly the feeling of the government is it's essential that the intelligence services and security services take a much more proactive role than they have done so far. In other words, trying to head off the problem before it actually emerges. In other words, to learn how to identify possible radical extremists when they're in the process of radicalisation, not when they've already been radicalised. That does, of course, raise all sorts of civil liberties issues. Does this mean that, therefore, they will monitor emails, telephone calls?
Exactly. Who draws the line?
Who draws the line?
Privacy,
which is a difficult thing in a country like Britain, where we have a tradition of civil liberties. But the government will argue, and indeed is arguing, we have to take these sorts of measures because it's in everybody's interest that radicalisation is halted and that certainly we prevent the sorts of incidents which, alas, have been taking place not only in the Middle East but in North Africa and increasingly on European soil, including here in Britain.
And what do you think of the Prime Minister's invitation of moderate Muslims, inviting them to speak up, investing and funding platforms even for them to speak up and counter-argue what they denounce, for example, when it comes to radical Islam, the rhetoric of preacher Anjem Choudhury and other hate preachers in London? It's quite an investment there to give them a platform.
It's an important investment in the sense that there has to be an engagement.
Why
by
did the
Muslim
BBC and
community.
mainstream media fail to offer such platform for moderate Muslims?
I don't think they've exactly failed to offer that platform. Quite a lot of moderate Muslims, if we want to use that word term, moderate, have certainly been on the BBC in interviews, in programmes. But what I think is
Perhaps
new,
not the most influential ones, though.
No, what's new at the moment, and I think important, is the Prime Minister is basically saying to not just the mosque leaders, but to the the wider Muslim community, including parents and relatives of young Muslims who are in danger of being radicalised, the time has come to stand up. Not, as an earlier guest was saying, in a patronising way to say, look, you Muslims, get your act together and fall in behind us, but basically to give a voice, to give a platform, because we all know the vast majority of UK Muslims oppose Islamic State and oppose the more barbaric forms of Islamic extremism. And therefore it's right that they're given platforms, it's right that they're given opportunities within a national dialogue.
To young and vulnerable people the brutal reality of its ideology. British media reported that Muslims in Birmingham gave a mixed reaction to David Cameron's speech on tackling extremism, with some echoing his condemnation of British Muslims who had travelled to Syria to join Islamic State, while others argued that he was unfairly stigmatising people.
Let me first welcome our guest, Mr. Jonathan Fryer. Thank you very much for coming. It's good to have you again on the show. And on confronting radical ideology, Mr. Cameron in his speech said that the most effective weapon to confront this is British liberal values. What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was basically addressing two audiences in Britain. One, if you like, the indigenous majority, to reassure them that the government is actually tackling this issue, which is so concerning to the public. But the other was directed at UK's Muslim population, which is a quite considerable and a fast-growing number of people. I have to say, although I suppose I'd call myself a liberal, the word liberal is a bit problematic for many Muslims, because particularly in the Arab world it has a connotation of a bit of sort of libertarian or of having a rather carefree lifestyle. So that in a sense is a problem, but I think British values in the sense of tolerance, in the sense of a form of pluralism.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Straightforward, brought to you by me, Khalil Khuwaili. This week we saw a remarkable speech by Britain's Prime Minister, Mr David Cameron. To some, it was about time to address the issue of extremism, and others believe that the situation requires a better understanding of Islam and not, as they argue, a crackdown on Islam. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, thousands are dying in the name of under the banner of takfir, the
integration in some areas that leaves young people vulnerable to the supposed glamour of ISIS propaganda.
Any strategy to defeat extremism must confront head-on the extreme ideology that underpins it. We must take its component parts to pieces: the cultish worldview, the conspiracy theories, and yes, the so-called glamorous parts of it as well. In doing so, let us not forget our strongest weapon, our own liberal values. We should expose their extremism for what it is, a belief system that glorifies violence and subjugates its people, not least Muslim people.
The Prime Minister said the government would work with Syrian, Iraqi and Kurdish communities who understand what life is like under ISIS to explain
of quasi-excommunication, where a Muslim can declare any non-Muslim an infidel, even though a declaration of takfir is generally considered null and void if the target refutes it or if the Islamic community in which he or she lives refuses to accept it. Despite this, people are being beheaded or bombed. Atrocities are occurring, atrocities that will perhaps stay in the memory of a generation. So before we welcome our guest today, let's have a look at this brief report.
In a keynote speech on Monday, British Prime Minister David Cameron set out the government's 5-year strategy for tackling extremist ideology, describing it as a struggle of our generation. Speaking in Birmingham, Cameron said Britain has to confront a lack of